When a man rejects you emotionally, one of the biggest mistakes he often makes is assuming your feelings will keep you attached to him forever. He believes that no matter how distant he becomes, no matter how clearly he pulls away, you will still continue chasing the connection. Another message, another explanation, another attempt to prove your love or fix what already broke. Because when someone becomes used to your emotional availability, they start seeing your attention as something permanent instead of something valuable. That is why at first he does not take your silence seriously. He expects a reaction from you. He expects sadness, emotional conversations, or efforts to reconnect. Maybe he thinks you simply need time before reaching out again. Maybe he assumes your feelings are too strong to let go quietly. In his mind, your attachment to him becomes a source of emotional comfort because he feels secure knowing you still care deeply regardless of how he treated the connection. And that emotional comfort creates complacency. See, people often become emotionally careless when they believe someone will always remain available to them. He became comfortable knowing you cared enough to stay emotionally invested even after disappointment. Your loyalty reassured him. Your patience reassured him. Even your pain reassured him because emotional reactions still proved he mattered deeply to you. But this time something feels different. Days begin passing without the emotional response he expected. No long explanations, no desperate attempts to change his mind, no emotional pressure trying to force closeness again, just silence. Calm, steady silence, and slowly that silence begins disrupting the emotional certainty he once felt. Because now he no longer understands where he stands in your life emotionally. At first, he may still feel confident. He tells himself you are simply upset temporarily. He assumes eventually your emotions will pull you back toward him the way they always did before. But as the silence continues, comfort slowly turns into curiosity. Now he starts checking for signs. Why did you suddenly stop reaching out? Why are you no longer trying to prove your feelings? Why does your silence feel heavier than emotional reactions ever did? Those questions begin growing because your absence removed the reassurance he once depended on. And this is where the emotional dynamic starts shifting completely. See, as long as someone believes they still have unlimited access to your heart, they rarely feel the fear of losing you. Your emotional availability keeps them comfortable, but silence changes that. Silence creates uncertainty. It removes predictability, and suddenly, the person who rejected you begins realizing your presence was never guaranteed the way they assumed. That realization unsettles him, because now he is forced to sit with something he never expected, the possibility that you may actually stop emotionally revolving around him. The possibility that your silence is not temporary pain, but emotional detachment. The possibility that you are learning how to move forward without needing his validation anymore. And for someone who once felt emotionally secure in your attachment, that shift becomes deeply uncomfortable. Meanwhile, your silence is doing something powerful for you too. It is helping you reclaim your dignity. Instead of exhausting yourself trying to convince someone to value you properly, you are protecting your peace. You are no longer abandoning yourself emotionally for the hope of being chosen correctly. And the more consistent your silence becomes, the more he begins realizing something painful. The person he thought would always chase him may finally be walking away emotionally for good. Because sometimes the strongest response to rejection is becoming silent long enough for your absence to reveal the value they overlooked while they still had access to you. The moment you stop reacting emotionally after his rejection, the entire power dynamic begins changing in ways he never expected. Before your silence, he still felt emotionally secure. Even if he rejected you, distanced himself, or acted inconsistent, your reactions reassured him that he still had access to your heart. Every emotional message, every attempt to explain yourself, every effort to reconnect reminded him that your feelings were still centered around him. And that gave him emotional control. Because as long as someone knows they can still affect your emotions deeply, They remain comfortable. Your attention becomes predictable. Your care becomes expected. Even your pain becomes reassurance because it proves they still matter to you emotionally. That is why emotional reactions after rejection often keep people emotionally powerful in your life longer than they deserve. But silence changes everything. The moment you stop chasing understanding, stop defending your worth, and stop trying to force emotional clarity, he loses the reassurance he once relied on. Suddenly, there are no emotional reactions feeding his confidence anymore. No constant reminders that you are still emotionally attached, just distance, quiet distance. And that quietness begins affecting him deeply, because now he no longer knows exactly how you feel. He cannot measure your emotions through reactions anymore. He cannot predict whether you still care, whether you are moving on, or whether he permanently lost emotional access to you. And uncertainty creates emotional pressure in ways emotional chaos never could. See, silence creates mystery. When someone can no longer read your emotions clearly, they begin thinking about you more. Your absence starts becoming noticeable because your energy is no longer constantly available to reassure them. The emotional certainty they once felt slowly disappears, and in its place comes reflection. Now he starts questioning things. Why did you stop trying? Why are you suddenly so calm? Have you finally accepted life without him? Are you becoming emotionally detached? Those questions begin growing because your silence removed the emotional control he once had over the situation. And what makes this even more powerful is that silence protects your dignity at the same time. Instead of begging for validation from someone who rejected your value, you quietly pull your energy back. You stop over-explaining yourself to someone who already understood your feelings but still failed to appreciate them properly. And through that emotional withdrawal, you begin reclaiming your self-respect piece by piece. That shift changes your energy completely. Now your silence feels strong instead of wounded, peaceful instead of desperate. And emotional calmness after rejection becomes unforgettable because most people expect rejection to make you emotionally chase harder, not emotionally detach gracefully. Meanwhile, he begins feeling something unfamiliar: loss of emotional certainty. He no longer knows if he still matters to you the same way. He no longer feels guaranteed access to your attention or emotional loyalty. And for someone who once felt secure in your attachment, that emotional uncertainty becomes difficult to ignore. Because people often underestimate your value while they still believe you will always remain emotionally available to them. But the moment you stop feeding their emotional comfort through constant reactions, they are finally forced to confront what life feels like without your energy surrounding them. That is the real power of silence, not manipulation, not revenge, but emotional withdrawal that forces someone to realize your absence instead of constantly benefiting from your presence. And sometimes the moment someone begins feeling your value most deeply is the moment you stop giving them emotional access to your heart so freely. At first, he may not fully understand what your silence is doing to him emotionally. Pride can delay realization for a while. Distractions can temporarily cover the emptiness. He may convince himself that rejecting you is the right decision, and that life will continue exactly the same without your emotional presence around him. But slowly, quietly, something begins changing inside him. He starts feeling the void you left behind, because whether he admitted it or not, your presence brought emotional comfort into his life. Your attention, your loyalty, your support, your consistency, those things became part of his emotional routine. Even if he failed to appreciate them properly while you were there, they still affected him deeply. And once that energy disappears, the absence becomes impossible to ignore forever. That is the painful truth about taking someone for granted. People often fail to recognize the value of emotional consistency while they still have unlimited access to it. They become used to the care, used to the reassurance, used to the feeling of knowing someone genuinely loves them. And because it becomes familiar, they stop seeing how rare it actually is. But silence changes that The moment your attention disappears, the emotional atmosphere around him shifts completely. The messages stop. The emotional reassurance fades. The loyalty he once relied on quietly becomes unavailable. And now, for the first time, he is forced to experience life without the emotional warmth your presence provided so naturally. That void begins showing up in unexpected moments. Late at night when distractions fade. During ordinary parts of the day when he instinctively thinks about reaching out. In moments when he realizes no one else understands him emotionally the same way you did. Suddenly, your absence feels louder because your energy is no longer there softening his emotional world. And what makes this harder for him is realizing your silence feels calm. You are no longer emotionally chasing him after the rejection. No longer trying to force your way back into his life. No longer exhausting yourself trying to prove your worth. Instead, you quietly pulled your energy away. And that emotional withdrawal forces him to sit with the emptiness your absence created instead of constantly benefiting from your presence. Now he begins replaying memories differently. He remembers the little things he overlooked, your patience, your emotional support, the way you genuinely cared even when things became difficult. And slowly he starts understanding that people who love deeply and consistently are not easy to replace. That realization creates regret, not because you are trying to punish him emotionally, but because absence naturally exposes value. Your silence removed the emotional comfort he once took for granted, and now he has space to feel what losing that comfort actually means. Meanwhile, you are beginning to heal. The energy that once went into chasing validation after rejection is now returning to yourself. You stop abandoning your dignity, trying to make someone recognize your value. You stop forcing emotional closeness with someone who failed to appreciate your presence properly the first time. And through that healing, your silence becomes even more powerful. Because now your absence no longer feels emotional or desperate. It feels intentional, peaceful, final. And that calm distance forces him to confront something painful. The person who once cared deeply may no longer be emotionally available to him the same way again. Because sometimes people only realize how much emotional peace you brought into their life after your silence forces them to live without it completely. One of the things that unsettles him most after rejecting you is not anger, not sadness, and not emotional chaos. It is your calmness. Because deep down, he expected a reaction. He expected emotional messages, attempts to reconnect, or signs that his rejection completely shattered your emotional world. He expected your pain to remain visible because visible pain would reassure him that he still controlled how you felt. But instead, you became quiet. And that silence combined with calmness begins affecting him in ways he did not expect. Because emotional reactions are predictable. When someone cries, argues, begs, or constantly explains themselves, the other person still feels emotionally secure. They know they still matter deeply. They know they still have influence over your emotions. Even rejection feels less final when someone continues emotionally chasing afterward. But calm silence creates uncertainty. Now he no longer knows what is happening inside your mind. He cannot measure your emotions through reactions anymore. He cannot tell whether you still care deeply, whether you are healing or whether you finally realized your worth and emotionally detached from him completely. And uncertainty creates emotional pressure. See, when someone can no longer predict your emotional behavior, they begin thinking about you differently. Your silence becomes mysterious because it removes reassurance. He starts questioning things he never worried about before. Did you finally move on? Are you happier without him? Did rejection make you stronger instead of weaker? Have you emotionally accepted life without him already? Those thoughts begin growing because your calmness disrupted the emotional control he once believed he had. And what makes your calmness so powerful is that it communicates dignity. You are no longer begging someone to see your value after they rejected you. You are no longer exhausting yourself trying to convince someone to choose you correctly. Instead, you quietly step back and protect your peace. And that emotional discipline changes the way he sees you completely, because most people expect heartbreak to create desperation. They expect emotional collapse. They expect anger. They expect someone to lose themselves emotionally after rejection. But they do not expect someone to respond with grace, silence, and self-respect. That kind of quiet confidence becomes unforgettable because it feels emotionally strong. Meanwhile, your calmness also changes you internally. You stop letting temporary emotions control your actions. You stop seeking validation from someone who failed to appreciate your worth properly. You begin understanding that your value does not decrease simply because someone could not recognize it emotionally. That realization creates confidence, not loud confidence. Quiet confidence. The kind that no longer needs constant reassurance to feel secure within itself. And once your energy shifts into that calm emotional strength, people feel the difference immediately. Now he starts replaying the rejection differently. At first, he may have felt emotionally comfortable, believing you would continue chasing him despite the pain. But now your silence makes him question everything. Your calmness forces him to sit with the possibility that he may have underestimated someone who was capable of walking away peacefully instead of fighting endlessly for someone who already let go. And that realization becomes emotionally haunting because calmness after rejection sends a message louder than emotional reactions ever could. You are no longer willing to sacrifice your peace, trying to hold on to someone who failed to value your heart properly. And sometimes the silence that hurts someone most is the silence of a person who finally realized their worth and stopped needing validation from the one who rejected them. When he rejected you, he probably expected heartbreak to keep you emotionally attached. He thought the pain would make you chase harder, overthink more, or remain stuck, emotionally waiting for his validation. Deep down, he assumed your world would continue revolving around him even after the rejection. And in the beginning, maybe it did hurt more than you could explain. Maybe you questioned your worth. Maybe you replayed every memory, every conversation, every moment trying to understand why someone you cared about could walk away so easily. But something unexpected happened. Instead of allowing the rejection to destroy you, you started changing. Quickly, slowly, powerfully. At first, the growth was internal. You began realizing how exhausting it was to keep seeking validation from someone who already showed emotional inconsistency. You became tired of carrying emotional pain that was draining your confidence and peace. And eventually, you made a decision that changed everything. You stopped making the rejection the center of your identity. That is when your transformation began. Instead of pouring your energy into sadness endlessly, you redirected it back into yourself. You started healing mentally, taking care of your body, protecting your peace, rebuilding your confidence. You focused on your goals, your future, your emotional stability. And little by little, the pain that once controlled your thoughts started becoming fuel for growth instead of emotional destruction. Your entire energy changed. You stopped chasing people who failed to recognize your value properly. You stopped begging for emotional reassurance. You stopped allowing someone else's inability to love you correctly to define your self-worth. And through that process, you became calmer, stronger, wiser, and more emotionally disciplined. That transformation affects him more deeply than emotional reactions ever could, because while he expected rejection to weaken you emotionally, he now sees someone evolving instead of collapsing. He sees someone becoming more confident instead of desperate, more peaceful instead of bitter, more focused on growth instead of revenge. And that creates a completely different emotional impact. See, anger fades, arguments disappear. Emotional chasing eventually loses meaning, but growth stays visible. Watching someone become stronger after heartbreak forces people to confront what they underestimated emotionally. Now he begins seeing your value differently. The loyalty he once overlooked suddenly feels rare. The emotional depth he rejected now feels meaningful. The calm confidence you develop through healing becomes attractive because it shows you no longer depend on his validation to feel complete. And what unsettles him most is realizing your silence was not weakness, it was transformation. He expected your pain to keep you emotionally available forever. Instead, the rejection became the reason you rebuilt yourself into someone stronger than before. And through that growth, you naturally became less emotionally dependent on someone who failed to appreciate your heart properly the first time. That realization creates regret because now he understands something too late. The person he rejected did not stay broken. They evolved. They healed. They learned how to choose themselves instead of constantly chasing emotional acceptance from someone else. Meanwhile, your focus is no longer centered on whether he regrets losing you. That is the true sign of growth. Your happiness no longer depends on someone realizing your worth after rejecting it. You are no longer trying to prove yourself to people who could not see your value clearly when you were giving them genuine love. And once you reach that level of healing, your presence changes forever. Because sometimes the deepest impact you can leave on someone is showing them that the rejection they thought would destroy, you actually became the reason you discovered your strength. By the time he fully understands what your silence meant, the emotional distance between you has already grown too deep to ignore. That is the part people rarely expect. In the beginning, he thought your silence was temporary. He believed eventually you would return emotionally, explain your feelings again, or continue fighting for the connection despite the rejection. He assumed your attachment would keep you emotionally available no matter what happened. But silence changes people. What began as pain slowly became acceptance. What began as heartbreak slowly became healing. And while he was expecting emotional reactions, you were quietly learning how to live without needing his validation anymore. That realization hits him late, because people often confuse loyalty with permanence. They assume that someone who loved deeply will always stay emotionally attached, no matter how much disappointment they experience. But eventually, every person reaches a point where protecting their peace becomes more important than holding on to someone who failed to value their heart properly. And your silence was the beginning of that transformation. At first, maybe you stayed quiet because you were hurt. Maybe speaking felt exhausting. Maybe you realized no amount of explaining could force someone to appreciate your worth correctly. But over time, your silence stopped being about pain and started becoming about freedom. Freedom from emotional chasing. Freedom from constantly seeking reassurance from someone who already rejected your love. Freedom from abandoning your self-respect just to remain emotionally connected to someone who could not see your value clearly. And through that process, you became emotionally different, calmer, stronger, more detached from the need for his approval. You stopped checking for signs constantly. Stop replaying every conversation searching for answers. Stop building your self-worth around whether someone finally realized what they lost. Meanwhile, he slowly begins realizing something painful. Your silence was not manipulation. It was closure. The person who once fought so hard to stay connected emotionally is no longer standing in the same emotional place. The version of you that waited endlessly for understanding has changed. Your energy feels distant now, peaceful now, emotionally unavailable in a way that feels real. And that is when regret becomes heavy, because now he starts recognizing everything too late. The loyalty you gave, the patience, the emotional depth, the consistency, the way you genuinely cared even while hurting. Those qualities become more valuable after your silence removes easy access to them completely. But by the time he fully understands your worth, you are no longer emotionally waiting for him to finally see it. That is the real power of healing. You stop needing closure from the person who hurt you because you created closure within yourself. You stop needing someone to regret losing you because your peace no longer depends on their realization. And once you reach that emotional freedom, Something beautiful happens. You become emotionally untouchable, not cold, not bitter, just healed. You no longer chase people who reject your value. You no longer beg for emotional consistency. You no longer sacrifice your peace trying to convince someone to choose you correctly. Instead, you choose yourself. And that quiet self-respect changes everything about your future. You move differently now. Love differently now. Protect your energy differently now. Because pain taught you that genuine love should never require losing yourself emotionally just to keep someone close. And sometimes the deepest regret someone carries is realizing too late that your silence was not asking them to come back. It was quietly saying goodbye forever.